So welcome back everyone. This session, Philosophy and Ethics in Deep Time, will be chaired by Tobias Tanton. Tobias is a lecturer in theology at Ripon College and an associate member of the Faculty of Theology and Religion here at the University of Oxford. His research on embodied cognition sits at the intersection of theology, philosophy and science. Over to you, Tobias.
Thank you very much, Natasha, and thank you to both Natasha and Tim for the invitation to share this really interesting session on the philosophy and ethics of deep time. We have in this third session for the day an opportunity to bring into conversation specialists in the philosophy of time and its social implications, as well as an environmental ethicist. So a really rich conversation to be had. Just a reminder that please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box as we go along and upvote questions that you would like to see answered. So to introduce the speakers for this third session, our first speaker will be Dr. Michelle Bastian. Dr. Bastian is a senior lecturer in environmental humanities at the Edinburgh College of Art. She's a philosopher who works in critical time studies in the environmental humanities. Of note, for the particular topic of today's conference, she was part of an editorial team on the Environmental Humanities Journal special issue on unexpected encounters in deep time. And she's also editor-in-chief of the journal Time and Society. After Dr. Bastian speaks, our second speaker in this session will be Professor Robin Atfield. Professor Atfield is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Cardiff University, who's published extensively in ethics, philosophy of religion, and history of philosophy. His most recent book, hot off the press, is Environmental Thought, A Short History, a publication which charts key developments in thinking on the environment from ancient times to the present. So without further ado, I will pass over to Dr. Michelle Bastian, our first speaker, for her presentation. And I believe she's also going to share some slides with us.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Tobias. Hopefully everybody can see that. A slide, okay? Okay, so I'm going to actually begin. I haven't done this previously because I haven't lived in Australia for a long time, but I just feel I've been feeling increasingly that it's more important for me to do this, an acknowledgement of country. So this is something quite common with those of you who've worked with the speakers from Australia will probably have heard this before. It's quite common to add it in. So I want to begin by acknowledging that I was raised and educated on the lands of the Ngunnawal people in what is now called Canberra, Australia. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Australia. So in working at the University of Edinburgh, I'm also supported by an institution that has benefited from the proceeds of transatlantic slave trade. I think it's important to acknowledge that to begin with. I'm partly prompted by Richard's point earlier today, and actually a couple of points that other speakers have made, and following a white paper from Anne Pasek on online conferences, which is really great, who herself was inspired by Claudia Alec and others. I can give you the link to this discussion that Claudia Alec and her colleagues had about land acknowledgements for online conferences. I also want to acknowledge that Zoom headquarters are located on what is now called San Jose, California, on the traditional lands of the Ohlone and Tamian peoples. And data produced through Zoom calls are stored and routed in Equinix data centers, and the closest one to me is in Manchester, UK, but there's many other ones and many other that are on Indigenous and contested lands. So I'd also like to acknowledge the Ohlone and Tamian peoples on whose land the infrastructure for our meeting is today in part supported by, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So thank you very much to Tim for inviting me today to this really exciting event. I'm also really pleased to be here with a number of people who I've been thinking about deep time with for nearly 8 years now. I worked out. It's sort of a very long-term thing in my own life. I was really pleased to receive this invitation, like others, because I actually hadn't had the chance to reflect really closely on what philosophy in particular could contribute to this area of thought, being more interdisciplinary in my thinking and way of working. And specifically continental philosophy, which I was trained in, and which has been my point of departure for the more interdisciplinary work that I've done since the PhD. So what I want to share with you in this short talk is a somewhat critical take on deep time, in that I'm not sure how much continental philosophy can help us thinking through its complexities. And I'm also not convinced that deep time itself and its synonym of long-term thinking can help us appropriately either. So I realize I'm making these claims somewhat against the grain, and offer them more as an alternative point of view, while recognizing that there are many complex and fascinating approaches that I won't be addressing here. I do want to share my concerns though, and I hope they will add usefully to the discussion. So I'll just start off with, just because the brief for the talk was to talk a bit about what our discipline can help us think about deep time. So what about deep time and continental philosophy? So my first effort to think this through suggests that deep time could very well be a concept that might be seen as deeply problematic and dangerous for understanding the true nature of time. So Bergson, Heidegger, sorry, ambulance coming by, Nazi sympathizer Heidegger and Husserl are my key reference points here. And I can't help but think that they would warn us off from the charisma of the unfathomable reaches of deep pasts and deep futures. While I couldn't find significant discussions in any of them about geological time, all of them were suspicious about the time, what they call the time of science, particularly in their discussion with physicists. Understanding time in terms of quantitative increments, so you'll find a lot of discussion in deep time talking about millions and billions, counting these years and using that partly as the way to create this charisma and this unfathomableness. So thinking about time in terms of quantitative increments, ones that do not require subjective experience to validate, which exist abstractly, and which turn us away from the recognition of the way time springs forth from our own awareness, was rejected by all of them. Would they not also be suspicious of some of the ways that humanities have been engaging with deep time now? And to what extent would we want to follow them in this or critique their suspicions? So just those of you who are familiar with those approaches, just think about Bergson's worry about the spatialization of time and Heidegger's discussion of the they, which we'll talk a bit about, but clock time, quantitative time, how that takes us away from authentic relationship to our own being towards death and all this kind of stuff. So another issue for thinking through continental philosophy in deep time is not only their deep suspicion, that comes with many people in this field of scientific time, but also their lack of interest in what we might call social time. So the time of coordination, of negotiation, of planned interaction. This is also widely rejected within work on phenomenological time. So we don't have warnings just against scientists, we have warnings against society and its pressures as well, or the they, as Heidegger calls it, which also distract us from the time that we give to ourselves, the time that they see as authentic. In this case then, aren't we steered away from many of the problems that we've talked about today? Things like intergenerational responsibility, reimagining social infrastructures. These kinds of things are explicitly taken off the cards within phenomenological discussions of time as not being what we should talk about or not being of interest, not being the concern for these fields. So there's 2 points there of are they useful because they cut out all these aspects of time, but also do they trouble deep time itself? So indeed, while more recent work such as that of Levinas and Derrida have focused on time in terms of the unexpected arrival of the other, so things like incalculable futures, that they encourage an attitude of hospitality towards, the negative approach to calculable time remains. As a really fascinating article from the philosopher David Wood pointed out in relation to Derrida's thinking about the future, or the to come as he calls it, surely our problem is that we are unable to act on very real calculable risks presented by climate change, a problem which the ethical drive towards the incalculable away from calculated time seems to ignore, and a task which it does not help with. So that's a few just sort of scattered thoughts, but just ways that actually, you know, I think it's quite difficult to draw on continental philosophy for this, thinking of this through. So I'm not saying that it definitely cannot provide pathways for thinking through an ethical deep time. David Wood's own recent book, Deep Time, Dark Times on Being Geologically Human, is just one example of you know, someone who's worked trying to do this. But I do want to flag up, excuse me, that there are also blocks to these pathways. However, in the rest of my talk, I want to unpack two aspects that I think we might want to keep. First, this worry about calculability and the quantification of time, even if we might be limits around that problematizing of calculability. And second, the emphasis on ethical features requiring a ceding of control by those who with the most at stake in the future, remaining a continuation of the present. So this is something you find a lot in Derrida's work as well, the problematization of those who want the future to be as similar as possible to the present. So there's a push there to cede control over over what the future might be, who can shape what that future is, and interrupt that dominant path by others. So I want to talk about those two aspects. So in terms of the quantification of time, I want to pick up on one of the examples used in the blurb, and I'll just change my, oops, sorry, you should have been enjoying that picture of Bergson there while I was talking about his work in Husserl and Heidegger. So let's talk about the quantification of time in relation to deep time. And I want to pick up on one of the examples that was used in the blurb for this event. So the clock of the long now, which is a common example of long-term thinking. It gets brought up in lots of different kinds of cases. And my worry here mirrors the ones that I have around this idea of sustaining times in a paper that's published in Humanities. So these times that we suggest will lead us to more sustainable futures, like slow time, rebalanced working hours, and long-term thinking. Too often when talking about these concepts, we slide into questions about pace, speed, duration, times quantification, and we overlook the underlying problems of coordination, relationality, and responsibility. The clock of the long now, for example, is sold as a tool for long-term thinking, one which will encourage long-term responsibility. The strategy is to build a clock that runs for 10,000 years and to raise awareness in many ways, many different ways, but one of them, you know, rewriting dates to include a 0 in front of them. So 2021 would be 02021. This clock, however, is funded by Jeff Bezos himself, sorry, excuse me, also credited with long-term thinking. So in this post, you can see a recent article about someone who's a thought leader. You know, if you read the rest of the article, it's very, very positive about Jeff Bezos and his long-term thinking and his patience, and how we should all be learning from him about thinking in the long term and thinking about profitability. And then on the other side, of course, you've got this recent investigation. Sorry. Talking about how much waste, you know, that's just been recently uncovered, millions of items being destroyed, you know, which might really force us to think about what really is meant by long term in this case. So while the clock, so Jeff Bezos, you know, is credited with long-term thinking, but as we know, is also responsible for the creation of a massive infrastructure that encourages short-term thinking in its users and wasteful and exploitative practices. So while the clock of the long now seeks to make long-term thinking automatic, the aim of Amazon is arguably to encourage expectations of speed and immediacy. New innovations from one-click ordering, Amazon Prime, the Kindle, and even the long-term storage service provided by Glacier market themselves on their swiftness and ease of use. You don't need to think about all the externals because Amazon will manage them for you. So compare this to a recent statement from the philanthropist Mackenzie Scott, which acts as a pointed critique to her ex-husband's approach to social change and even long-term thinking. Here she criticizes these vast infrastructures and in a more useful account of what it should really mean to think about the long term, she emphasizes the need to support relationships within communities. And there's a little quote here, shouldn't her call to stop having to work every weekend to get some sleep, shouldn't this actually be our catchphrase for a more sustainable future, which is built on inclusivity and strengthening community agency and responsibility rather than something like the clock of the long now? Should we instead think about Bezos's funding of the clock of the long now, which isn't thinking about social time, but thinking about chronological time? Shouldn't we think about this as a type of chrono washing instead of greenwashing that we would do well to be suspicious of? So the second aspect that I want to draw out and emphasize is something that we see more in Derrida and others' work, is that an ethical approach to the future is one which confronts the desire for things to remain much as they are already, and emphasize instead futures which are changed, challenged, and transformed by others, and other meaning here those not in privilege and control at the center of things. And here I suggest that listening closely to what many Indigenous philosophers and scholars have been discussing in terms of kinship time may in fact be more in line with this than deep time. Here I'm thinking of Deborah Bird-Rose's engagement with the ideas shared by her Indigenous Australian teachers, and particularly a recent essay by Kyle Powers-White, a Potawatomi scholar called Kinship Time, and thanks to Anna Katerina Laboussiere for alerting me to this. You can see the title there, Time as Kinship. The issues that they both raise encourage us to ask, does deep time help us to focus those most privileged on the responsibilities that they have in the present? Does it encourage us to look at the shadow places that the clock of Amazon and all of its ilk use to support current ways of doing and being? Some will say yes, but only when it is used carefully. And so, in so much as deep time intersects with what we are doing right here, right now. But as White points out, and this is a quote from him, kinship time as opposed to linear time reveals how today's climate change risks are already caused by people's not taking responsibility for one another's safety, well-being, and self-determination. Any solutions to climate change will be enacted within a state of affairs that is already rife with irresponsibility. White thus challenges the linear time of quantification and calculability, and instead shares a variety of Indigenous scholars telling the time of climate change in terms of shifts in kinship relationships, not in terms of geological shifts or shifts in trends over hundreds of years or things like this. Opposing the IPCC urging to act within the next 10 years, which is arguably an abstract quantitative claim, White reminds us that from the perspective of kinship time, change must happen in terms of how well-constructed relationships of interdependence are. Here it is trust, justice, and responsibility that moves the temporalities of change, not the counting of moments. Here we might want to ask whether white people will find the prompts of deep time necessary for thinking through the consequences of carbon, coal, concrete, plastics pollution, because the lives that are being negatively affected by these things right now, disproportionately brown, black, and Indigenous lives, are not sufficient motivation for action right now. Will we only be motivated, and I include myself here, by a longer term, which shows the destruction of ways of life that we most benefit from most clearly? So there's much more to be learned from White's and others' work, but I want to end here and suggest that suggests that arguing that deep time thinking is a good response to short-term thinking is a trap. We need to diagnose both the problem and the solution differently, i.e. the problem is temporal processes that destroy kinship or responsibility sovereignty. Describing this through the shorthand of short-term thinking disappears all these layers of what is actually being done by those with privilege. Likewise, the solution is coalition solidarity kinship, the specific everyday work of dismantling privilege, an everyday shot through with deep time, yes, but an everyday that looks to what's happening right now just as much as deep past and deep futures. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Michelle, thank you very much for that presentation.
Sorry for all the coughing. I get when I'm a little bit nervous, I get irritated throat. So thanks for listening through all that, everybody.
As someone who you won't know this, but as someone who grew up in Canberra, Australia, I appreciate your acknowledgement of country and recognition of animal people, as well as the way in which you wove Indigenous ideas and insights into your own response to continental philosophy. Thank you for such a rich paper. We go on now to our second speaker, Professor Robin Atfield. Robin, welcome and thank you for joining us today, and over to you for your paper.
Thank you for your welcome and thank you very much for inviting me. My overall title is Deep Time and Environmental Ethics, and my first short section is called The Bearing of Deep Time on the Scope of Intrinsic Value. Which states of affairs are valuable in themselves rather than derivatively, or valuable intrinsically rather than extrinsically? The lessons of evolution, and thus of the deep time of the past, nudge us towards a relatively comprehensive view. There is a debate between those who hold that intrinsic value is limited to conscious states such as pleasure and preference satisfaction, and those who also include objective states such as health and well-being. But all or nearly all parties hold that at least pleasure has intrinsic value and that pain has intrinsic disvalue. John Nolt has recently drawn attention to some relevant lessons of evolution. Our evolutionary cousins of the animal kingdom have learned from pleasure and pain over the centuries in ways that actually promote their well-being or that of their species, whether through eating food with relish for vitality, or through sex, which generates new lives, or through avoiding pains and poisons and conveying pain avoidance to their descendants, which promotes their and their descendants' health and well-being. I get this from Nolt's book, Environmental Ethics for the Long Term of 2015. So pleasure and pain have extrinsic or derivative value and disvalue, as well as intrinsic value or disvalue, and have long had the biological function of promoting well-being. This suggests that what is valuable in their lives is not only sentience and pleasant experiences, but also their well-being and health, and that the same applies to the lives of human beings. We can approach this question in another way. What is intrinsically valuable is what there is independent reason to pursue or promote. But there is reason to promote health and well-being for their own sake, and not only for the positive experiences which they facilitate. Thus, the point of COVID injections is not pleasant experiences, but improved health. Contemporary behaviour thus confirms the lessons that Nolt rightly draws from evolution and the past. Well, I said it was a short section, and it's followed by a section called The Well-Being of Species. The well-being of species remains to be spelled out. Some theorists hold that species have a well-being greater than that of their members, while others, like Nolt and myself, hold that it consists simply of the well-being of their members. To reflect on this question, we need to bring in both the past and the future, and sometimes the distant future. For there must be more to the well-being of species than the well-being of their current members, as emerges if we reflect on the possibility that the species might become extinct with the deaths of all the current members, or rather of the last of the current members of the species. This would be bad for the species, even if all its members had led flourishing lives. As Nolte comments, the view that there is more to the well-being of a species than the well-being of its current members omits the well-being of future members. I have in fact made this point in the past several times over, although Nolte writes as if no one had said this. Thus, the well-being of a species consists in that of its members, past, present, and future. Further, as Nolte goes on to say, what the premature extinction of a species does to that species is to eliminate the well-being that would have been enjoyed by its members from the time of the premature extinction to the time that it would otherwise have gone extinct. Once the well-being of such possible future species members is included, there is nothing more to add. We now have a grasp of the good of the species across time. There are no duties to species that are not owed to present and future members, and some would say past members. And while their well-being has intrinsic value, saying this amounts to saying that the well-being of their present and future members has value of this kind. Now to a third short section, duties extend to other species. Conversely, we need to take account of the future before we can discover our duties or obligations to a species, and to the human species not least. For we can make foreseeable differences to future generations, both human and non-human, and neglecting to consider such impacts distorts our understanding of what we should do in the present. Aristotle once wrote that we cannot include future generations in our ethical deliberations because that makes them too complex. But this was a misguided view even at the time that he wrote it. Yet at that time, as Hans Jonas has written, the impacts of human action were seen as affecting almost exclusively the human contemporaries of the agent, and any long-term outcomes could apparently be disregarded as serendipitous and unpredictable side effects. But at least nowadays, because of technology, and I'm still following Hans Jonas here, at least nowadays because of technology, the impacts of a great deal of human action have to be recognized as affecting large swathes of the biosphere and future generations for many centuries to come. Besides, we might add, anthropogenic climate change is disrupting many ecosystems and driving numerous species to migrate polewards, such that they often run out of habitats as they migrate. And while Jonas may not have been aware of influences such as this one, he was well aware of human impacts on wetlands, watersheds, rivers, and oceans. This recognition led Jonas to reject any form of anthropocentric ethic. Jonas was aware of the many ways in which technology and the spread of human settlements are affecting non-human species and their prospects of survival into the future, and felt that the scope of ethical concern should expand to match this increased sphere of influence and impact. While he was greatly concerned about the human future, his concern was not limited to that. Certainly, if non-human creatures are regarded as having moral standing, as was argued by Kenneth Goodpaster in 1978, then the case for this expansion of ethical concern is compelling. Well, now to my final section, which is called Ethics and the Post-Human Future. Concern has been widely expressed about what is called the Anthropocene, or the period in which humanity has become the predominant influence on the surface of our planet. However, less concern has been expressed about the impact of human-generated extinctions on the distant future. But as Kirchner and Weil have argued in the journal Nature, today's anthropogenic extinctions will diminish diversity for millions of years to come. They wrote that in 2000. These extinctions could well still be having an effect when humanity itself becomes extinct. Human extinction, it goes without saying, should be avoided if at all possible, to prevent inter alia the disappearance of human history and human culture. But that said, it by no means follows that our moral concern should be limited to the period of human existence. As if we could say, echoing Louis XIV, après nous le déluge. Some reflection should, I suggest, be given to the impacts of present actions and policies on the period after humanity becomes extinct. For there are many species that could survive into that period and flourish in it, but could instead become extinct through human action in the near future. Now, if we are focusing on the human future, then conventional human-centered ethics can maintain that these extinctions are made wrong by their impact on ourselves and our successors, who are deprived of objects of scientific inquiry and of aesthetic appreciation too. But if instead we focus on the post-human future and the period of reduced biodiversity that would ensue if anthropogenic extinctions proceed at the current rate, then, as Nolte remarks, anthropocentric ethics has nothing to say, as there are no human rights or interests to consider with respect to this post-human period. If there is anything bad about the reduced biodiversity of this non-human period, only a non-anthropocentric theory can explain it, and say why this reduction should have been prevented much earlier, when the human beings who could have prevented it were still alive. But granted that human behavior could make a difference to the extent of the biodiversity of the post-human period, it appears unconvincing to claim that just because there are no longer human beings around to regret or bemoan the absence of species that their predecessors used to experience, there is nothing for anyone to bemoan at all. For if we take measures to preserve rainforests and temperate forests, and to preserve or reseed coral reefs, and to establish maritime sanctuaries, and take further measures to reduce oil pollution in our oceans, plastic pollution in our oceans and continents, and greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, then we could at least mitigate species loss across the entire future, to such an extent that the entire future would be positively affected. There are grounds based on human interests for such measures, but when we focus on the post-human period, it emerges that we have almost certainly further grounds to avoid the elimination of creatures that could have enjoyed life in that human-free epoch. Thus, consideration of the post-human future strongly suggests that we need an ethic that transcends one that is anthropocentric and takes a non-anthropocentric form, and one that, in the light of what was argued earlier about the reducibility of appeals to the good of species, is biocentric. A biocentric ethic appeals to the good of living creatures in general, but unlike ecocentrism, does not additionally appeal to the good of species or of ecosystems. The good of all the members of all the terrestrial species and of all the terrestrial ecosystems has been taken into account by biocentrism already in considering the interests of individual creatures, and there is no reason to count them again as components of species or as participants in ecosystems. We should by all means attempt to understand how species preserve themselves and how ecosystems function, but only in these ways shall we manage to preserve their valuable members. But this does not mean that species or ecosystems are independent focuses of moral concern. So, putting all this together, it turns out that reflections on the evolutionary past and on the post-human future throw light on the adequacy of ethical approaches in the present. And that only when we consider their trajectory across time can we understand what the good of species consists in. The scope of intrinsic value should not be confined to subjective states such as pleasure and preference satisfaction, but should extend to objective states such as well-being as well. And the range of organisms whose well-being should be taken into account should not be confined either to human beings or even to creatures with sentience and thus with subjective states, but recognized to include all living creatures, since all have a good of their own which they seek to defend and propagate. I'll leave things there.
Robin, thank you very much for that very expansive paper, which covered so much territory and very rigorously and comprehensively set out an ethic with the far future and post-human future in mind. I'd like to bring our two speakers into conversation with each other now. Michelle, if I could start with you, I guess there are a number of themes which Robin mentioned in his paper, which might mesh quite closely with your notion that coalition, solidarity, kinship are part of the solution that you see. Was there anything in that paper you'd like to respond to, or anything you'd like to ask of Robin in response to his paper?
Yeah, well, I mean, I should say they're not my ideas. They're the ideas of well, Kyle Powers-White was the person that I was quoting. Just to, I mean, I know that happens when we present papers, but they're definitely not sort of passing along things that have been shared by others, because I found them really useful, I guess, for my own thinking and to really try and challenge myself about what the deep time was sort of meaning. And I guess I don't know, like I think maybe, Robin, I don't know if there's sort of different paradigms at work maybe about you know, within philosophical ethics, about trying to find justifications and reasons for being ethical for others. You know, that there's, just having read White's paper this morning about, you know, thinking about kinship, thinking about not just other species in the abstract, but as living beings, you know, Earth, others that we share life with on this planet. Do we need to think about justifications in that kind of abstract way, I suppose, rather than a way that's thinking about you know, solidarity with the one, you know, we all make each other's lives possible, I suppose. And so there's a much more knitted together understanding of what our responsibilities are for each other, rather than an abstract idea of should species be allowed to flourish or not flourish, because you know, it's only with us flourishing together, you know, apart from certain viruses and other things, that any life is possible, I suppose. So I guess it's just you know, what's going on with that feeling of distance from these other living beings that we share a planet with, I suppose. I mean, do you feel that, Robin, in the way that the ethical frame's constructed, or?
Well, let me respond by recounting a conversation I was overhearing in a supermarket this morning. So there was a guy whose concern was about fish, both the fish that we eat and the fish that we see on television. and he was saying the trouble is microplastics. Now, I think the relevance of this is that justifications can be abstract if they're general, and they can be particular if we have a particular concern about, say, the fish that we eat. He was explaining the mechanism to the man at the counter, which explaining how microplastics get into the sewage system and indirectly get into fish, and how they're all affected, and the microplastics are too small. But well, that's an explanation rather than a justification. But I'm sure what he was justifying is that we should take efforts to avoid bestrewing the planet with plastic. But as far as he was concerned, it was a non-abstract because particular justification and explanation. And I think the focus on both explanations and justifications can be defended in that manner. Just as mathematics seems altogether abstract until you find you have to count what you've got in the till. But I very much liked what you were saying about white, and so can I turn to kinship time? And I have nothing but praise for the idea of kinship time. I think looking at your paper earlier, and by the way, thanks very much for sending me a prior draft. I think you've hit on an important point in saying that what is going to be important in coming decades as well as centuries is trust and relationships, awareness of kinship, and the sense of responsibility that can generate. Of course, a lot of the people around us are not kin, but I think the kinship ethic could be broadened out into a concern for our non-kindred neighbours. So I think,
yeah, I mean, he's talking about kin very broadly in his paper.
Right.
He redefines it, so it's not just family relationship.
Okay, well, construe it
in that Western
very
sense.
broadly. So I think that we do need in making proposals about the future need to think about those matters much more than we customarily do, and what you were reminding us of your background and traditions, and I was wondering if I should have started with praise of the Welsh predecessors who possibly used to farm the land where this house is, and probably use the Welsh language in doing so, but it would have taken me off the subject perhaps. But it also strikes me that this doesn't actually undermine the case for thinking about deep time and its implications, and also for thinking about foreseeable time. I agree that we can overcalculate, we can do too much calculation, but I think we do have to bear in mind the urgency of the environmental crisis, and it does seem that it's in the next few years that we can make a huge difference. So I think we compare that up with kinship time and kinship ethics, and we need to take into account what we can foresee, something which Aristotle I think would not have disagreed with, even though I suppose he was drawing the line at about the next 50 years, and what he thought we could usefully reflect on. So I mean, I think kinship time is a very positive suggestion, but I think it should be blended with the messages of taking longer periods of time into account in the manner of the thinkers who thought about deep time.
Michelle, would you like to respond to any of those comments?
Oh, well, I mean, if there's any questions, I'm happy to, just because I've already been talking for quite a bit, if anybody wanted to send any through. I mean, I can, but.
Well, there are a few questions, so we can turn now to some Q&A. And actually, there was an earlier question which Michelle's already had a chance to respond to in terms of some text, but I'm wondering if it would be helpful to bring that forward into the conversation so that others can hear that conversation taking place as well. So Laura Opdebeck has written, Michelle, I largely agree with your critical take on the clock of long time now, but I want to offer a little pushback to what you said about the clock of long time being largely unconcerned with social time. I don't think that's quite right. The clock of the long now is imagined by Brand & Co. as a pilgrimage destination, a library, and the Long Now Foundation itself is concerned with coordination and community building. This community is still a privileged one, of course, but the services it claims to offer are social, are they not? Question mark. So you've already responded a little bit in the text, Michelle, but would you like to flesh out a response to that question and the social dimension of the clock of the long now?
Yeah, I mean, I guess. Thank you, Laura, so much for that question. And you'll see from my comment that, yeah, I agree with you that they are trying to sort of build that community. You know, they have regular talks, which they have online and things like this. But as someone who's had a Google alert set up on them for the last decade or so, if that is what they're really interested in, they're not doing a very good job of it because it barely gets mentioned. And most of the time, you know, in articles and news and, you know, popular culture, it's not really that well known in terms of, you know, it gets an offhand comment every now and again when you're talking about long-term thinking. And I think what's the main interest that they have is the technical challenge, the geek out factor that they talk about of how to build this thing, and the fantasy of having you know, people in 10,000 years who've lost all their technology gazing on this thing in wonder. You know, there's discussions that sort of give that sense. And if they're really interested in it, I do feel that the way we could test that is how do they deal with their funder of Jeff Bezos? Is he, you know, Brian Eno talked about not just the long now, but the big here, which is about paying attention to inequalities in the present, and then aligning themselves with and chrono washing Jeff Bezos. They really undermine that, I think. So are they challenging Bezos on the social infrastructures that he's created, on whether or not he's really integrating long-term thinking in his work? Do they challenge him on that, or do they keep fawning over him? You know, that would be my test, I suppose.
I'm wondering, in that response, and in Robin's earlier comments as well, on his encounter in the supermarket and this question of microplastics, there seems to be kind of close parallel with Marx's thinking here, and kind of a return to thinking about what are actually the material conditions. Michelle, and your category of chrono washing, which, you know, as you argue, seeks to divert by a certain kind of symbolism, risks losing that material reality underneath. Is that a fair observation of both of your positions in a sense?
Robin, did you want to?
No, I think that was mainly addressed. I have something to say, but I think it's mainly to Michelle, so perhaps she should speak first.
I mean, I guess what I do share something with the kind of continental philosophers who've been worried about the quantification of time. I guess my worry about it is thinking about, which comes from, you know, discussions with Deborah Bird-Rose and other people about time as something that we make in our relationships with each other. It's not something that just happens, that just seems to happen. It has to be made, there has to be work done, there has to be things moved, you know, there has to be infrastructures, there has to be all this kind of thing. And that's what my worry about when critiques of unsustainable time, you know, might start off focusing on those things. So when you see slow time, for example, the focus there was on you know, unfair working conditions and product lines in Italy and things like this, and you know, unions and things like this. It's just become about this sort of quantitative thing about pace, about doing something slower then becomes more ethical, but when that was not what the slow food movement was really talking about. So that's the thing, and I'm worried that something similar is happening with this idea of deep time. potentially, that when we use the terms of the short term and the long term, that we start thinking in this quantitative way, that it's about length of time that we're considering, when really the issue underneath, you know, as so many Indigenous scholars and decolonial scholars are arguing, is that the problem is destruction of relationships, imposition of other ones, extraction of resources. You know, this is what short-term, long-term is covering over, and not drawing out clearly enough, I think, but instead allowing a kind of shift to thinking that it's just about, you know, instead of thinking about election cycles, let's think about oak tree cycles or something, you know.
So can I sort of add in there? I welcome the suggestion that we don't forget about Marxian approaches and the material implications of all these matters. But can I also say that that people looking at the continental tradition should possibly focus from time to time on Hans Jonas, who does seem to be having quite a considerable impact. I chiefly come across him through a research student who was very interested in his work. But when I went to a World Congress of Philosophy in Seoul, Korea, there were quite a number of papers showing that his interest in his work has reached East Asia. There were sort of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean contributions, which were quite fruitfully developing his work. I'm from a different tradition. I'm from the analytic tradition, as Michelle is clearly acknowledging with her reaction there. But I find there's a kind of a fertile interweaving of these traditions from time to time, and in the works of Hans Jonas, that's a good example.
Thank you, Robin. That brings us nicely to a question that's come up in the chat. And the question asks, multi-species kinship ties tend to be particularized and localized to some degree. And so the question is, does Jonas's argument about expanding ethical regard in keeping with the expanding reach of impacts call for a more generalized and delocalized understanding of the ethics of kinship time? So I guess this goes back to definitions of kinship and how broadly one is using that term, and does it inevitably have kind of localized and particularized connotations? Robin, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think the questioner is right to say that the Hans Jonas's move and the moves I've been commending do urge us to think about the whole of humanity and the whole foreseeable stretch of the future, and indeed, as I've been suggesting, the post-human future too. However, there'll be possibly half of the people listening will think we can't have that. If we lose contact with the local, we lose everything that we're most committed to. What is and the element of truth in that approach, I think, is that we all need to get our motivations for caring for whatever it is that we do care about, whether it's our kin or neighbours or people the other side of the world or people of the next few generations. We need to generate our motivation from somewhere, and our locality, if not also our kinship ties, are central sources. Much more could be said, but I suppose we can separate out the questions of the source of our motivation from the scope of our concern. And so I want to suggest that our concern should be pretty universal, but the sources of our motivation may frequently be local.
Michelle, would you like to make any comment on that tension between kinship and kind of connection with the local versus this also more expansive notion of kinship that you hinted at?
Yeah, I mean, I just put a link to a talk that I listened to the other day on Afro and Indigenous futures, which is on Living Land, which is partly, what was fueling my thinking today. But Esme Murdoch in there talks about the importance of emphasizing the theory that's been, which has been said by many people, that the theory that presents itself as universal and general is actually specific to a certain group of people, a certain culture. It is localized, and what happens, as Robin was saying, but then the question is, what happens when it presents itself as general and local, as general and not local? And then maybe part of the challenge there is to refuse that division between local and universal and general and situated, and that, what kind of work has that done in the past of there's been feminist critiques of this as well, of feminist interventions being situated rather than a general theory, that in philosophy that's come through a few times. So that work of the general and the local does work in elevating certain people from specific, localized, culturally specific locations, for their ideas to be thought about in a certain way, and everybody else's to be thought in as the general, the local, specific, the not the local, specific, the exemplar or something. So I guess what I would say is that you can't, the generalized is also perhaps a bit of a trap to think, who is the people who can get there and make those kinds of generalized claims, and who can't traditionally, and to always understand your knowledge production as localized. What might that do? How does that help us think about this in different ways? And that it's not a one or the other, that there's ways of rooting in place and shifting to broader contexts while remaining rooted and responsible to your relationships.
Thank you very much, Michelle. We've got time just about for one final question, and a question from Mary has been sitting in the Q&A for a while. Mary asked to you, Robin, specifically, I wonder if you'd like to share opinions on environmental ethics, justice, and human nature, and the human nature relation within the context of urban nature. So, Robin, are there any particular applications of your argument to the question of urbanization, and does urbanization throw up any particular issues which you would see fall under the purview of the paper you gave today?
I have good friend who's a Marxist who I think 30 years ago would have said really that he doesn't think most people are aware of the changes of the seasons. I think he's changed his view more recently. Urbanization, of course, has affected half the human population of the world. So we, in fact, half the human population living in cities, and it's quite important, accordingly, that there should be green open spaces, particularly if the biophilia theory is right, and actually we all have an inbuilt need either to experience greenness or possibly green blueness, and but maybe stretches of water help as well. So it may be that if is it Ed Wilson, wasn't it? If Ed Wilson was right, it may be that we all actually have a need, and that would reflect itself in the lives of urban dwellers, such as I have become. I think I was brought up in a village, and therefore you could say in the countryside. I mean, I'm fortunate because I live on fairly near to the edge of a city, so I can walk up into the hills anytime that I'm feeling energetic, and greatly appreciate both the woods and the other folk that I meet also enjoying said woods. But it does really mean that there are big problems of city planning, and there are places where people are living on top of one another in a way that must strain their capacities for retaining the milk of human kindness. So I think we do have to put a lot of effort into planning urban infrastructures, and of course we also should not forget the non-human life of cities, which documentary makers are drawing to our attention. So it's not only that we need things like ducks and geese and swans to look at in the park. They too have their needs. So just to finish off this particular rant, there is a guy who keeps sending me emails about the importance of having urban corridors for hedgehogs to get through fences, so that they can actually have the kind of range that they need to support their lives. And I'm sure the same applies to a whole lot of other species, such as the frogs that my son-in-law has just come across, resident in their pond.
Wonderful, thank you. A lovely illustration and note on which to wrap up our session. Michelle and Robin, thank you both for your rich presentations, and also the way in which you've engaged questions and conversation. Those of you who've hung around philosophy departments at any point in time will know that it's not always that continental and analytic philosophers come into the same room in such a warm and amicable and constructive manner. And I think it's a real testament to both the intellectual breadth and the intellectual generosity of both of our seminar participants that we have had such a rich and fruitful conversation here today.